In this tutorial, we're going to paint these loose, whimsical watercolor florals in a simple and easy composition. These are some of my favorite ways to paint flowers, and we'll go through the entire process step by step. Let's get started. As always, the supplies and the colors that I use in this tutorial are listed below in the description box if you're curious what I'm using. So we're going to do three main flowers, top left, middle right, and then one kind of in between the two flowers down at the bottom. And I have my size 4 round brush loaded up with some warm yellow. And I'll be using the very tip of my brush to paint the stamen of this first flower. So the stamen is the very center, just using that very pointy tip to make these wispy marks. And I also have plenty of water in there too because our flower petals are going to be pink. But sometimes I want to be able to pull a little bit of that yellow in there too for some more interesting colors in the petals. So now I'm going to move to a size 6 brush, so it's slightly larger, and I'm going to load up my blush pink color. It's a very watery mixture of it at this point. I like to start lighter and then add darker colors on top. You can always add darker colors on top. So I'm going to start with the tip of my brush and just make these really quick up and down strokes for the flower petals. So a lot of my other tutorials, we place down our brush and lift back up. But this one we're going up and back down and making very loose, rounded petals. So let's start with the tip of your brush, pull out some color, and make a petal just like that. So you're pulling it back to the center. And it's nice and light at this point because it's a very watered down mixture. Again, you pull out that color, round it out, and pull back down towards the stamen. And I really like to make these petals very bouncy and round and whimsical. Some of them are a little bit thicker and bigger, some of them are thinner and daintier, but you're just kind of making these very quick petal motions, and you can start to see this flower start to form. And because I was talking so much at the beginning, the yellow already dried, but we can just go ahead and re-wet it a little bit. So just adding a little more of that, and you can see that really beautiful bleed of yellow going into the petals, and that's what I love about these flowers. So again, you can see my brush just kind of pressing down and rounding its way back to the center to create these petals. And my petal for the very bottom is going to be a little bit different. It's just going to be a horizontal kind of almond shape for a different perspective. And this is a very light one. Like I said, I like to start lighter because you can always drop in darker color on top. So that's what I'm going to do now, just slightly darker pigment. And because it's still wet, this is called the wet on wet technique. And so that darker pink just kind of gently bleeds out into the petal, and it's really pretty. And I don't want to go overboard here, but just kind of dropping in a little more color here and there. And as my last step, I'm going to go back in one more time and just slightly darken that yellow part. Watercolors always dry lighter than when you originally put paint onto paper, so I usually just like to go back in and deepen that color a little bit. So there's our first flower, and we're going to be doing the same thing for our second flower, but we want them to be facing different directions. I don't want to make the second flower pointing to the top left as well, so my next flower is going to be pointing to the right side of the page, and I want it kind of butting up to this first flower. So I'm going to start the same way we did the first time, using the tip of my brush, it's a size 4, to make these little wispy marks for the stamen using my warm yellow. Again, I'm going to start pretty light with these pink petals and do the same exact technique, starting with the tip of my brush, and then just really curving it around and pulling it back toward the center. Just like that. So you get these really beautiful, round, bouncy petals. And you don't have to do that part, but I really just like to add in those little wispy marks in between the petals. It just helps it look a little more interesting in my opinion. And I'll just continue adding these petals. This one's a little bit bigger. And you want to make sure that you're varying the petals. You don't want them to all look identical. You don't want the flower to look symmetrical. So just keep your wrist nice and loose and let your brush expand out on the page and then quickly bring it back to the center. That's how you get these shapes of petals. So I'll add a few more little petals here, and they're going to be shorter here at the bottom because it's a slightly different perspective. And same as we did last time, at this point I'm going to drop in a little bit more color on top. And I'm actually going to add a little more color to this first flower too while it's still wet, just to get a couple of those last little bleeds before it dries. And I'll do the same thing here on the second flower. These petals are still nice and wet. Again, this is called the wet on wet technique, just dropping in some additional color and letting it expand out on the petals. So you're just kind of accentuating and emphasizing the loose vibe of these flowers. And this is also a great time to practice water control, because if you have too much water on the page and you're not able to control it, you're going to end up with petals which then dry with really harsh edges. But if you don't have enough water, then you're not going to get any bleeding at all. So this is a great project to kind of get the hang of water control. So just darkening the center here with a little more of that yellow, and now we can do our third and final primary flower, and then we'll get into the fillers and the leaves. For this last flower, it's going to be more similar to this first one where you have this sideways petal at the bottom. So I'm actually going to turn my page upside down so that I can paint it correctly. Once again, starting with my warm yellow, using the very tip of my brush, and I'm just painting in this U-shaped stamen. Again, stamen is the center of the flower. And then we'll start with the petals. So I have my pink in my brush, start with the tip, apply pressure and bring it back down. That's a little darker than I wanted, so I'll just water it down a little bit more. And you can see every petal in this painting looks a little bit different, and that's what I love about this style of flower. And that's why I call it whimsical. And because that yellow is still nice and wet for the stamen, you get these gentle bleeds into the pink petals. And again, just making a horizontal almond shape for that very bottom petal. And that gives it a little more of a unique perspective. So once again, while it's still wet, oops, that's really dark. That's okay, I'll just lighten that up a bit. But while it's still wet, I'm adding a bit of a darker value on top and watching that pigment just bleed and gently expand into the petals. And same thing with the yellows here, just kind of darkening that center again, allowing the color to bleed. Now I'll turn my page back to the right side up. So there are our three primary flowers. They're looking nice and beautiful, and now we can add our first layer of leaves. For my leaves, I'm starting with a very light, gentle value of green. And one little secret trick that I like to do that I'll share with you is I like to add a little bit of the pink of the flower that I'm working on to my green mixture, which helps to mute it a little bit, and it helps just kind of make it more cohesive and tie it all together. So here we will be adding additional greenery and filler flowers, but I like to start with this very first layer of kind of bigger leaves to stage the shape of the overall composition. So I'll start by adding a leaf here up at the top, and I switch to my size 8 round brush, so it's a little bit bigger. I'm just applying some pressure down, adding a little bit of movement to that leaf, and I'll add another little leaf coming off on the right side. So at this point, we're just kind of setting that first base layer, adding movement to the composition. And so I'm going to add another leaf here coming down at the bottom. So I start with light pressure, apply more pressure down, and then lift back up to create a nice shape with the pointy tip. And I like to wiggle my brush a bit so you don't get too perfect of edges. And I just like to make sure my leaves have some good movement to them. And I like to add these little wispy marks. Again, this is really light value, so we'll go back in with a darker value later to add some additional greenery and filler flowers. but this just helps me figure out what direction I want to do. So let's also add another leaf coming off of the center flower too. You can see it drooping down a little bit, and this also helps to fill in any white space between the three main elements. And I'll do one more little leaf just above that bottom one. So I just want to make sure this composition has some nice movement. Usually I like to go from top left through the middle and then down to the bottom right. I don't ever want to have leaves that are sticking straight out or anything that looks too static or uniform, so that we can get some nice movement. So that is looking good for our first layer, and now I want to add some dainty little wildflowers, and I'll be using the same color palette. Now, similar to some of my other tutorials, when I add fillers, I usually like to start with a pencil, just so I can kind of sketch out where I want those fillers to go without committing with paint. So let's go ahead and sketch in. I'm just going to put a couple flowers. I still want the main flowers to be the focus, but I'm just going to add one coming off of this leaf up at the top corner. I'm not sketching in full flower outlines. I'm just putting a little shape of where the stem is coming from. I'll also have one coming here, and I usually like to have a lot of curve to my stems when I add these fillers. So I'll have two up here. That means I should put some down here as well. Might as well just follow this little stem that I've already painted. So I just kind of pencil it in, and that way if I see it and it's not making sense, I can just go ahead and erase it without committing to anything. So I'll just have one there since it's kind of crowded already. And let's add one final one coming off of here. But it's feeling a little bare on this top right corner, so I'm going to add another little filler right here, making sure to curve my stem. And there we go. So this is just where I'm going to add the flowers. We'll do a second layer of greenery too, but let's just go ahead and add the flowers now. I've zoomed you in a bit closer so you can see it a little better. Here you can see where the little sketch outline is. I have the stem and then these two little lines that indicate where the flower is going to attach. And you can really have full creative freedom here. I don't really have a super clear technique for how I do these flowers. I just kind of add some wispy marks, and it just helps to add a little something something to the composition. So I'll start with the warm yellow again, keeping the color palette nice and cohesive. Don't feel like you have to make the same paint marks that I'm making. Feel free to get creative, but I'm going to pull my brush toward the center for these petals. So I'll add a little mark there, and let's have one really droopy petal coming off the right side. And I'm just pulling everything towards the center. This one's a little bit bigger. I'm leaving white space between the petals. And they're just kind of these funky little flowers. They're a lot smaller. They don't take anything away from the main flower, but they're just really fun. And fillers can also be a really great way to add more movement and fix shape problems. So if your composition's feeling too static or you have a direction that you don't really like, you can always add more fillers to help define your shape and add more movement. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that for now. It'll look a lot better once we add the stems, but we need some time for the flower to dry. So I'll come back to that one. And for now, we'll just go ahead and add all of our little fillers, starting with the yellow and just barely tapping in some little marks. And now I'll go ahead and load up my brush with more of this pink color. I do like to have it a little bit darker just to differentiate from those main flowers and add a little bit of contrast. And also, if you want to expand your color palette, by all means, go for it. I prefer more of a limited color palette and just working with different color values, but this would also be a great place to add yellow fillers or maybe some light blue, Just really feel free to make it your own. Again, these are just to add a fun little pop of color and some movement, so no pressure on these guys. And this is, again, one of those trust the process type of flowers. Like I said, they look very weird at this stage, but once they dry and we're able to add the stems and some more foliage, it'll really help tie the whole piece together. And as it dries, you can also go back in and tap in some darker color. Like I said, it always dries lighter. And at this point, again, I'll flip my paper upside down so that I can work on the bottom ones, and I'll do the same exact process. So just be sure to take your time, start with the yellow, and then add your pink petals, or whatever color you're choosing to work with. All right, so now they're starting to dry. I've grabbed a darker value of green, so I'm going quite a bit darker than our first layer. And I'm gonna add a little bit of an attaching stem here using the very tip of my brush. It's a size 4 with a nice pointy tip. And just adding that little connecting stem, tapping that in, and then again using the very tip of my brush to connect it with the rest of the foliage and making sure to add a lot of nice movement. I never want anything to be super straight. It wouldn't look very realistic and it wouldn't flow with the rest of the painting. So I always make sure to add very curvy stems when I attach my fillers. And while I do that, I usually, you know my tutorials by now, I love to add these little wispy marks. So I'll just go ahead and work my way around, adding these little connectors to each of the filler flowers. Again, just make sure those flowers are dry first so that your green doesn't bleed into the flower, because you really want to make sure you can maintain that delicate light yellow and pink of the flower. So you don't want that green to bleed in there. And then go ahead and connect it with the rest of the composition. So I'll go over that one more time to darken it a bit. Add my little wispy marks. All right, and now you can start to see, I zoomed you out a little bit, you can start to really see some great movement. It looks very whimsical and fun, and we haven't even finished the composition. So adding more fillers and adding some more foliage will really help to tie it all together and make it look a little more full. So we have a few more of these little wildflowers to do. Again, just gently filling in the stem, making sure it's nice and connected, and using just the very tip of my round brush to connect it all. And I added that little leaf here because a lot of this movement was angled upward, and then this one was coming, even though it has a curve to the stem, it's a little more straight to the side than I would like. So adding this overlapping leaf just helps to offset that a little bit. And like I said, we will be adding more leaves as we go. But for now, I just want to make sure I can connect all of these. I have 2 more to go down at the bottom. Again, make sure that flower is nice and dry so that the green does not bleed into it, and then using the very tip of my brush to add some movement to that stem and connect the flower with the rest of the composition. So now we're on to the very last little filler wildflower here, just filling it in with the tip of my brush and connecting it with a little dainty stem. All right, so I'm really liking how these wildflowers added a whole lot of movement to the piece and a little more of an interesting look. So Now that all of those are in place, all of our primary stuff is done. Now it's just adding some additional greenery and some foliage to just fill it in a little bit more. You can see I've already added a couple of little leaves, and I'm going to continue doing that. Again, you don't want to overdo it, but I do like to have lots of overlapping leaves and elements around to just help it look a little more organic and natural. So at this point, just be sure to take a step back and look at your piece from afar every now and then to make sure you're not going overboard. And you can see this one's a little too straight for my liking, so just like I did with the other one, I'm going to add an overlapping leaf coming up and another little wispy stem coming down. And as I said, this type of foliage does help to beef up the overall composition, but I also like to use them as a way to fix any areas of your piece that look a little too static, or if there's a shape or direction that you don't necessarily like, you can kind of correct those by adding some curvy leaves or some other elements that just kind of distract from that a little bit. Or if you have one side that's a little heavier and one that's too light, you can add some more elements and greenery to the light side just to help make it a little more balanced. So there's a lot that you can do with these finishing touches. And this is where I really encourage you to make these decisions based off of your own painting, because we're not all going to have the exact same painting. So if there's an area of yours that needs to be fixed, then by all means go ahead and do that. And also, if you want to add more fillers than I did, definitely do that, because I honestly just kind of ran out of room on my piece. And I don't have room for much more than this, but normally I like to add at least a few more flowers than I did on this one. So if you have the room for it and you'd like to, then definitely go ahead and do that. So I'm just adding some wispy lines here and some additional leaves, nothing too crazy, just filling it in a little bit more. And right now I'm actually working on producing my next Skillshare class, which is going to be a 15-day floral watercolor challenge, and we're going to get a lot of practice with compositions like this one. And this is one of the paintings that I was considering adding to the class, but it did not make the cut. I have lots of other ones to paint, so I thought it would be a good one to bring over to YouTube. So let's see, it's feeling pretty balanced, maybe a little too heavy on the bottom side, so I'll add one more leaf up at the top. And just adding a couple more wispy lines here, trying not to overdo it, but since that leaf is a little bit darker, I'm going to also darken the value of a little more down here at the bottom. I want to keep everything balanced. And there we go. So this is a very happy, very whimsical type of composition. I love it. The color palette goes nicely together. I really like that the main elements have a very soft romantic pink, and then the wildflowers add a nice pop of color. But again, you can really use any colors you'd like for a painting like this, and be sure to let me know in the comments if you have any favorite color palettes that you like to work with. I'm always up for trying something new. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in another tutorial very soon.